Curitato and Bosmarque or Bosmahis or Bosfongyen, depending on what part of the world you're in and what the time is now. Thank you for listening to my talk on complement clauses in Vatlongos. So I'm going to start by introducing Vatlongos, talk a little bit about transitivity in Vatlongos and then complement clauses in Vatlongos, explain why I don't think that complement clauses can be analysed as clausal objects in Vatlongos, and then talk a bit about how complement taking verbs relate to transitivity in Vatlongos. Finally, look at an example of raising or matrix coding in Vatlongos before drawing some conclusions. So let's start by getting to know Vatlongos. So Vatlongos is an oceanic language of central Vanuatu. It originates in and is also known as Southeast Ambrim. It's spoken by around 3,000 people in the villages of Southeast Ambrim, which you can see in this map, and also in Melimat, a relocated community just outside Port Vila. It has subject, verb, object, constituent order. It has fairly complex verbal morphology, including verbal prefixes which mark subject agreement, relative tense and some mood categories, and also verbal suffixes marking transitivity and pronominal objects, which we'll look at more closely. There is also verb initial consonant mutation. The data for this presentation was recorded between 2014 and 2017 during my PhD project. It contains a variety of genres. It includes speakers from all villages that speak Vatlongos. There's a 66,000 total words, including elicitation. But if I make claims about frequency, that's based on the 48,000 word subcorpus of spontaneous text, because obviously unusual grammatical features tend to crop up more frequently in elicitation. Most of these texts are available via Pangloss, depending on the wishes of the speaker, along with timelined glossing and videos. The Pangloss website has been redone this year and it's looking really great, so please do have a look if you're interested. Okay, let's talk about transitivity in Vatlongos. Verbs in Vatlongos can be categorized into two morphological classes based on transitivity. Morphologically transitive verbs have to occur with an explicit object argument, which can be marked in one of two ways, either as a noun phrase immediately following the verb, which you can see in example 1, or as a pronominal suffix, and we find this type of suffix with about a quarter of the tokens of morphologically transitive verbs in the corpus. These suffixes are only available for third person, first person singular or second person singular objects. If not, you have to use an independent pronoun, and the shape is lexically determined as either e, a, ni, or a zeromorph, which follows a high front vowel. You can see an example in 2. Importantly, you can't have both, so you can't say napusi nim, and you also can't have neither, so you can't just say napus and leave it at that, hoping that people know that it means it. It's very strict that you have to have either the noun phrase or the object suffix, and that becomes important for our analysis of what's going on with complement clauses later. Morphologically intransitive verbs, on the other hand, usually occur without an object, as you'd expect from the name, but they can be marked with a transitivizer suffix ni, which accounts for about 1/10 of the tokens of these morphologically intransitive verbs in the corpus. If this suffix occurs by itself without any object noun phrase following, then it indicates a third person object, which is what we get with latapolni, they did it. But it can also be followed by an object noun phrase, mapolni polienak, meaning we do this work. But notice that this transitivizing suffix does co-occur with an object noun phrase, unlike the object marking suffixes that we saw for morphologically transitive verbs. Okay, that was transitivity. I hope you can remember all of that for when we get into complement clauses and what's going on there. Complement clauses are pretty frequent in Vatlongos, occurring once every 51 words in the subcorpus of spontaneous texts, and they're selected by verbs which express desire, speech, cognition, perception, emotion, ability, causation, comparison, and inception. So pretty similar to what we expect to find cross-linguistically. Complement clauses can be distinguished from serial verb constructions by the optional presence of a subject-noun phrase and a negative clitic. You can see both of those in bold in example 8. You can also have an auxiliary verb occurring inside the complement clause. And you can mark a complement clause with a subordinator, although complement clauses tend not to have subordinators overall. They're not as frequent as ones where there is no subordination. Complement clauses can also contain topicalized constituents, or basically any of the discourse strategies that are available in root clauses. So in example 11, the subject noun phrase is repeated once as a kind of establishing topic, making sure we know who we're talking about, and then again as the subject noun phrase. Whereas in 12, the possessor of the subject of the verb is used as a topic. Complement clauses can be distinguished from serial verb constructions by a lot of freedom in the marking of tense, aspect, mood, and polarity. This is different from what's described for Parmese complement clauses by Terry Crowley, and Parmese is the most closely related language to Vatlongos. The polarity of the matrix and complement clause can be different in all different tense, aspect, mood contexts, which is different than is possible for serial verb constructions. So in the first one, you can see that the matrix clause is in affirmative polarity and the complement clause is in negative polarity. Vice versa for 13. And then you see the same thing for 14. There are some lexical tendencies in relation to tense, aspect, mood marking, and also some tendencies in relation to the polarity of the matrix verb. So complement taking verbs that express desire tend to take either immediate future or distant future complements, and negated complement taking verbs also often take immediate future or distant future complements. But it's the intended semantic interpretation that determines the tense, aspect, mood, and polarity marking in the complement clause, not just a kind of straightforward, oh, if you've got this verb in the matrix clause, you have to have this this temp marking in the complement clause, or oh, because this is negated, it has to be it also has to be immediate future in the complement clause. And that's different from what's been described for Parmese. So, for example, the use of non-future in 16 tells us that the event in the complement did happen. So if they said they didn't see him jump back in his canoe, and we don't know whether, the speaker doesn't know whether or not he jumped in the canoe, we might have used future there. But because we know that it did happen, we're going to use non-future, and that lets the listener know that it did happen. Similarly, in this last one, we've got talking about somebody who does something bad, but he doesn't know it's bad. This misar, the fact that it's non-future marking rather than future marking, tells us that the speaker and all of us probably agree that what we're talking about is bad. Okay, so now let's talk about whether these complement clauses can be analysed as clausal objects. Complement clauses are sometimes described as clausal objects. For example, in Dixon's typological view of complement clauses, that's how he analyses them. And there are good reasons for that. Often they have a similar semantic role in relation to the verb in the matrix clause as the object of the same or related verb lexeme used transitively, depending your analysis of what a lexeme is. They often occur in a similar position in the clause as an object noun phrase. So for example, after the verb in this case in Vatlongos. And they can often be substituted for a pronoun or a noun phrase. But Vatlongos complement clauses have a different distribution from objects. Firstly, object noun phrases have to occur immediately after the verb. The only thing that can intervene is the negative clitic in some cases. But adverbs can intervene between a verb and a complement clause. So you can see that with vari in 18 and tu in 19. The object noun phrases can also sometimes be followed by the negative clitic, which you can see in 20. But complement clauses always follow any negative clitic in the matrix clause. You don't have a choice about where to put the negative clitic in relation to the complement clause. However, I do think this is slightly weaker evidence because it might be that it's motivated by the semantic role of complement clauses. Less affected semantic roles tend to follow the negative clitic, and complement clauses tend to be stimuli. Another bit of evidence is that, which I think is very strong evidence, is that object noun phrases never co-occur with an object suffix on transitive verbs, but complement clauses do. So we saw when we were looking at transitivity that you can't say something like napusinim, you can't have an object noun phrase following the object suffix. But this is the most frequent thing to happen with morphologically transitive complement taking verbs. They tend to have this third person default marking, which you can see in 9, 14 and 16. So hopefully I've convinced you that complement clauses are not just clausal objects. So let's have a bit of a closer look at the relationship between complement taking verbs and transitivity in Vatlongos. When morphologically transitive complement taking verbs take a complement clause, they also take a semantically empty third person object suffix, which is what we just saw in 9, 14 and 16. The only time that this doesn't happen, for those of you who have been paying close attention to the examples throughout, is before a negative clitic. So that's a context where these suffixes usually don't appear in simple clauses either. On the other hand, when morphologically intransitive verbs take a complement clause, they are usually marked with the transitivizer suffix. So, mitemenini asu mastal, polni ruftena churchasmult, and then again with misakni. All of these intransitive complement taking verbs take a transitivizer. I think probably the likely explanation for this is that there's a kind of causative meaning of the transitivized verb, which better reflects the relationship between the verb and the complement clause. An exception to either of these patterns is a couple of speech verbs. These speech verbs don't act like morphologically transitive verbs or intransitive verbs. So the complement taking verbs hit and hitene, which can mean say or want, and the verb ha, which just means say, never take object indexing suffixes or the transitivizer ni. They always occur in those forms. And they also occur with direct quotations, not just complement clauses, strictly speaking. Okay, now let's look at what I think is a really interesting thing that's going on with Vatlongos complement clauses. So with complement taking verbs of perception, the subject of the complement clause can be expressed as an object in the matrix clause. So this is equivalent to the phenomenon that have been described as raising or as matrix coding from a slightly different theoretical background. This is a phenomenon that is rarely observed in oceanic languages of Vanuatu, and that's partly just because lots of the diagnostics that are typically used to tell us when raising or matrix coding has happened just aren't available. So because you have cross-indexing of subjects, it could be that you can't really tell the difference between whether that noun phrase is genuinely just the subject or whether it's doing something else and it's just being has a co-referential subject prefix, because a lot of these verbs nearly always take some kind of subject marking. There's also a lack of case marking on noun phrase arguments in most of these languages. And you also have switch subject serial verb constructions, which can be the preferred strategy for the kind of typical meanings that involve raising. There are strict constraints on the presence and marking of objects with morphologically transitive verbs in Vatlongos, however, that mean that we can identify raising. The absence of an object suffix on a morphologically transitive verb in the matrix clause means that the following noun phrase must be the object of the verb. And that falls out from what we saw happened with transitivity marking. for these morphologically transitive verbs. You have to either have an object noun phrase or an object suffix. And in these ones, if you say that there's no object suffix there, if you say that tas in this example isn't the object, then this just la long by itself would be ungrammatical. So you have la long tas. Tas is the object of the matrix clause, but it's also the subject of the complement clause. They heard the C making a noise. And you can compare that to if there isn't raising, you do get the object suffix e at the end of milonge, la long. So we can see the same thing in examples 25 compared to 14. When the subject is not raised to the matrix clause, we have third person object suffix marked as napusi. But for 25, we just have pus by itself, which tells us that uhiahe must be the object of pus as well as the subject of mite. Just thinking about how this relates to our earlier discussion of whether complement clauses are objects or not, the fact that an object noun phrase can occur between the verb and the complement clause is further evidence that complement clauses are not the same thing as clausal objects. A co-referential subject noun phrase can't appear in the complement clause. So you can't say opus mail himilo. You can't have the raising and then also have some kind of like overt noun phrase subject occurring in the complement clause. But you can have an auxiliary verb appearing in the complement clause, which suggests that these clauses are finite. Because the ability for an auxiliary verb to occur seems to be the best indicator of finiteness in Vatlongos. So we see that we've got really strong evidence for raising or matrix coding happening with morphologically transitive complement taking verbs. But when the complement taking verb is morphologically intransitive, we don't have clear evidence for determining if the subject has been raised to the matrix clause or not. So for example, in 28, because you could have this transitivized intransitive verb occurring with or without object, it looks like we can't decide whether this has been raised or not. So we don't know whether this is better analysed as the complement clause starting here with the subject noun phrase occurring inside the complement clause, or whether it's better analysed as the object noun phrase occurring in the matrix clause. So you could analyse that as either you made me completely black or you made it so I'm completely black. And that's because the transitivizer suffix can co-occur with an object noun phrase. Okay, so let's draw some conclusions from this. Firstly, complement clauses in Vatlongos can't be analysed as clausal objects. I hope I've persuaded you of that. They're also distinct from serialised verb phrases, and they're not constrained in terms of tam marking, which is unlike what's been described for closely related Parmese. They're not constrained in terms of polarity marking, and they're not constrained in terms of the presence of any of the syntactic components of root clauses. You could have any of those things occurring in a complement clause. Most complement-taking verbs in Vatlongos are morphologically transitive or transitivized if they are morphologically intransitive. And morphologically transitive complement-taking verbs take an empty third-person object marking on the verb when they take a complement clause. And finally, the subject of the complement clause can be expressed as the object of the matrix clause, a phenomenon that is rarely found in Oceanic languages of Vanuatu. If you know of any examples of that happening in Oceanic languages of Vanuatu, or even just cross-linguistically, you know of an example where raising has been diagnosed by the absence of marking on the matrix verb, please let me know. I'd be very interested, and I haven't managed to find any clear-cut examples of that myself. Thank you. Here are some references. Thank you very much. Names Hamitel.